Hi, this is Doug Brown from the Mountainside Church of Christ, presenting episode 4 of the Mountainside Apologetics series, which is entitled Evolution versus Intelligent Design. Well, the first thing we should do is define evolution. The term has been used in different ways. I'm talking about Darwinian evolution. It's a hypothesis that all life evolved from a single one-celled life form. And this happened supposedly through two different mechanisms. One is mutations, genetic mutations that result in tiny changes, sometimes improvements to living organisms. And then the second mechanism is natural selection that preserves those changes that are beneficial to the organism and eliminates those that are not. Well, Charles Darwin wrote in his book On the Origin of the Species that introduced this concept of evolution. He said, "Nothing at first can appear more difficult to believe than that the more complex organs and instincts should have been perfected, not by means superior to, though analogous with, human reason, but by the accumulation of innumerable slight variations, each good for the individual possessor." And then he said, elsewhere in the book, "Why, if man can by patience select variations most useful to himself, should nature fail in selecting variations useful under changing conditions of life to her living products?" Well, I would agree that nature will select the traits that are useful, but that does not by itself account for this concept of Darwinian evolution. So that's evolution starting from a single one-celled life form. However, one might ask, where does the single one-celled life form come from? And that's where we get to the second evolutionary theory called chemical evolution. And that is a belief that natural processes, like lightning or something, could cause chemicals to combine and form life. So they have this belief that there was a primordial soup, some pool containing chemicals of various sorts, and that it could, under the right conditions, form life. Well, there was a famous experiment performed that resulted in some amino acids being created by an electrical discharge conducted in just the right conditions. And these amino acids, first of all, had to be preserved to keep them from deteriorating rather quickly. But amino acids are not life. They're just simple building blocks, molecules that are necessary for life. But life requires a complex assembly of these amino acids into proteins with all the right molecular machines and the DNA that allows the organism to function and reproduce. Now, claiming that this proves that life could accidentally be produced is kind of like pouring the ingredients of concrete into a rectangular hole and then getting out a block and claiming that a skyscraper could happen by chance. There's a big difference between getting a small building block and getting a complex structure. I believe that most Darwinian evolutionists believe in chemical evolution. That's pretty much the only concept they've come up with until more recently some have suggested that the first life on Earth came from outer space, as if that somehow answers the question regarding the origin of life. Obviously, where did that life from outer space come from? That doesn't really address the question. Well, why use the term intelligent design? This term was popularized after a meeting of respected scientists in Pajaro Dunes, California, back in 1993. These scientists came from various fields of study. They brought their particular knowledge from their field, and they discussed their doubts regarding evolution. They concluded during their discussion that there is ample evidence of intelligent design in nature. And this was captured, by the way, in a DVD entitled Unlocking the Mystery of Life by Illustra Media, which I've got a copy of and which you would probably find very interesting if you care at all about this subject. But when these scientists coined the term intelligent design, I suspect they thought it would be less polarizing than the term creation. Certainly it's more scientific because science really cannot prove anything about the designer of this world through scientific investigation. We can't prove that it's the God of the Bible. However, science can reveal evidence of intelligence in the design of the natural world. And so that's probably why they chose the term. It really has not been any more acceptable to mainstream scientists than the term creation. I think it's obvious to everyone that if there is an intelligent design in the universe and in life, then there must be an intelligent designer. And that brings us right back to God, which is where a lot of people don't want to go. So the question is, do creationists believe in natural selection? And evolutionists like to point out and say, nah, creationists don't even believe that natural selection works. And we do, absolutely. We know that unnatural selection, we call it selective breeding, has been used by mankind for thousands of years to select out certain traits in animals or plants that they want, and then people can propagate those traits through selective breeding. But when they do that, sometimes the breeding results in animals that are actually less healthy than the original animal. And I hold up bulldogs as a good example. Bulldogs are very hard to breed. I found that out from a friend of mine who bred them many years ago. They have very large heads, and they often have to have C-sections for the birth of a bulldog. But the selective breeding doesn't necessarily improve the breed, but it does select out certain traits that some people want. One thing that selective breeding cannot do is turn one kind of animal into another kind. It can't turn a dog by selective breeding into a cat. That requires introducing entirely new features that weren't present in the dogs. For example, retractable claws. That's pretty obvious about cats. But if the genetic material is not there in the dog breeds, you can't select it and breed cats out of dogs. You have to have some new DNA, some new features. So natural selection does indeed remove unfit organisms and preserves the fit, but it can't create new genetic material. Well, another thing about evolution is the fossil record does not support it. Charles Darwin admitted this in his book on the origin of the species, and I have a couple of quotes from that book. He says, "Why does not every collection of fossil remains afford plain evidence of the gradation and mutation of the forms of life? We meet with no such evidence, and this is the most obvious and forcible of many objections which may be urged against my theory." He said in another place in the same book, "Why, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not everywhere see innumerable transitional forms? Why is not all nature in confusion, instead of the species being, as we see them, well defined?" Very good questions, because that's what we see. We see obvious species, we see dogs, canines, we see cows, bovines, we see those. We can tell the difference, but we don't see something in between various species, or I should say genus or families. Species is too specific. Now we see the same problem here 150 years plus after Darwin. There's still a lack of transitional forms. Anthropologists have been searching for the missing link for a long time, the supposed link between apes and humans. And they found several that were highly touted as the missing link, and then subsequently determined that they weren't. And finally, no one really brought the attention to that fact. And so many people still believe there's a missing link, but every attempt at identifying one so far has failed. One theory that was invented to try to explain why the lack of transitional forms is called punctuated equilibrium. And that theory says that a small group of animals got off in an isolated area by themselves, and they quickly evolved to another form, and that's why we don't see any fossils. So that is an explanation from the lack of evidence, and doesn't really explain anything at all. It's simply a way of trying to cover up for Darwinian evolution by inventing an explanation for the lack of data. Finally, there is the Cambrian explosion that shows in the fossil record, and Darwin was even aware of this. It supposedly occurred about 530 million years ago, according to the evolutionary timeline, and it's named after the Cambrian layer of sedimentary rock that's been found in Wales. Interestingly, all the major plant and animal phyla, that is body types, are found in this layer, and most had no precursor in the supposedly older Precambrian layer below it. Thus, the comment is that these animal and plant types appeared suddenly. Well, Darwin admitted that's a problem. He said, "The case at present must remain inexplicable. and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained. So how, if evolution is accomplished by very small changes over a long period of time, would you find in a relatively short period of time of a few million years all of the various plant and animal types appearing? That doesn't really make sense according to evolutionary theory. It should have been spread out over a much longer period of time. Well, life exhibits a tremendous variety and complexity. There's so many kinds of plants and animals on this earth. And according to Darwin, he postulated a neat tree of life, lines of common descent starting with a single one-celled animal or plant and then branching out into all the different types of plants and animals and organisms and eventually into all of the forms of life we see today. Now, a contemporary of Darwin's named Haeckel drew a really nice tree of life. Darwin's drawings weren't very good, so he had some really crude hand drawings. So I put a copy of one of Haeckel's drawings, and that's an example of what's being postulated, what was postulated back in the time of Darwin. And evolutionists have been drawing these evolutionary trees, showing the descent of all of the plant and animal types from a single one-celled organism. They've been doing this. They haven't really, I don't think, agreed on a firm tree of life. And one of the problems is that although we can identify many organisms that are obviously closely related, I'd say the cat family, for example, you can kind of determine what animals would be related there and part of that family. The horse family, the equines, the zebras and horses and ponies, you can tell they're all very similar organisms and part of a family. But when you try to go further than that and say, well, where did the horse family come from? Where did the cat family come from? It's anybody's guess. It's a speculation, really. Now, I had an interesting story related to me by a friend back, must have been around 1980. I had a friend who was attending a major university working on his PhD in biology. And he had a professor who had assigned to the class, each student was supposed to draw a tree of life, work out some line of common descent of the plants and animals, and present that for a grade. Well, it turns out my friend told me that among the biology PhD students, this was considered a joke. They thought it was ridiculous. They didn't seem to believe that one could actually do that. But I guess they turned in their assignments and got their PhDs, etc. But, when people working in the field can't even take seriously an attempt to lay out the common descent of all life forms from a single form, there must be something suspect about the whole proposal. Well, you'd think now as we start to learn more about the genomes, and we've identified genes and worked out the human genome and I think many other organisms, you'd think that if organisms were descended from a common ancestor and very closely related, you'd see the genomes that were very similar. We don't really see that, not very often, and the best that can be said is that they do find some genes appearing in various unrelated organisms. Now, that doesn't prove that they are related or have a common ancestor, but some have even tried drawing a tree of life based upon single genes. And you'd ask, well, if you can draw one tree of life based upon this particular gene, what are you going to do when you include hundreds or thousands of other genes? Do you completely change the tree of life? So this is something that has been postulated, never proven, and I'm not sure there's even that much good evidence for such a common descent. Well, even a single cell, if you could simply show that a single cell somehow got created, that would be a tremendous accomplishment because a single cell is very complex. It contains thousands of molecular machines, which are a kind of protein. Just as examples of some of the molecular machines, there are cargo haulers that move proteins around the cell. There are switches that control the movement of proteins or particles between different parts of the cell, say between the nucleus and the area outside the nucleus. There are systems of cables, ropes, and pulleys. There are propulsion mechanisms that cause single-cell animals to move around. There are manufacturing machines, they're called ribosomes, that create proteins. They take the DNA and they use a portion of the DNA to create a protein and fold that protein into just the right shape. They're machines that read and copy the entire DNA string and even check it along the way. They're machines that create energy using chemical reactions in the cell. So a single cell is not the way Darwin thought it was, just a little bag of protoplasm. They've discovered that they're very complex machinery in a cell. And besides gates that separate the parts of a cell, there's a library of instructions we call DNA for building proteins. And that's exactly what it is. The proteins have to be assembled in the right string of amino acids, but they also have to be folded into just the right shape in order to perform their function. Well, I have a video here I'll try to show when I give this presentation in person. It's a YouTube video, and hopefully you can click on that if you're looking at this on the internet, or at least read the URL and go off and enter it into YouTube and watch this little computer simulation of a molecular machine called a kinesin in action. It's transporting cargo from one part of a cell to another. And the amazing thing about it is it has a walking motion with 2 feet and walks on a thing called a microtubule that seems to grow out in front of it as it needs it. But it's just truly amazing that we have things like this going on in our body, and these kinesins are moving relatively rapidly for the microscopic scale of the cell that they live in. DNA itself is a very complex library of instructions. It's composed of sequences of amino acids. There are 4 amino acids called A, C, G, and T, and they come in pairs, either AT or TA or CG and GC. They're arranged in a ladder. It's like a twisted ladder where the rungs of the ladder are these pairs of amino acids. And in the human body, the DNA has about 3 billion rungs, 3 billion pairs of letters strung out together. It contains all the instructions for building all the proteins and molecular machines in the body. It's pretty amazing. You can think of it as a computer program for building proteins. And of course, it doesn't build the proteins itself. It requires molecular machines that can read and interpret the instructions in the DNA and then build and fold the proteins accordingly. Unlike normal computer programs, it can be read forward and backward, and even starting at different points, and get different sets of instructions. I just found that totally amazing. Now, this is kind of my area of expertise, computer programming, computer science, and it's hard enough to build a computer program with a few hundred instructions that works correctly. I've never seen anybody even think about building a computer program that you can read going forward and going backward. We can only get them to work reading it going forward in some cases, and in other times we have trouble making that work. So this is a very complex program for building proteins. And we're not sure what else DNA encodes. I'd say from my reading, we're not sure exactly where the body gets the instructions for building the overall body plan. We know that DNA encodes proteins, and it may encode some other things as well. Interestingly, there are things in DNA that scientists didn't understand, and they called it junk DNA, and thought that maybe as much as 80% of the DNA in the body was junk DNA left over from earlier evolution. Well, of course, it's been discovered since then that a lot of this junk DNA does, in fact, serve useful purposes, so it's no longer junk. But that's kind of where we are as human beings trying to understand the complexity of our body. Well, what is irreducible complexity? This is a term that Dr. Michael Behe coined when he wrote a book entitled Darwin's Black Box back in 1996. I have a copy of that. Dr. Behe was a Nobel Prize-winning microbiologist and a tenured professor in a university when he wrote this book. In the book, he described 5 biochemical mechanisms that are so complex and that take so many parts it's not possible to introduce them by a succession of small incremental steps. One of those, by the way, we'll talk about in a minute, is the bacterial cellular flagellum, the little thing that propels the bacteria. There's the eye, there's blood clotting, and a couple of other things. And he goes through those in great detail, talks about all the chemical reactions and mechanisms that have to be just so in place in order for the function to work. If any part is introduced by itself, then it would provide no advantage to the organism and would be eliminated by natural selection. So we have to ask, how did it get here if you can't introduce it one piece at a time, and it's going to be eliminated because each piece provides no advantage by itself? Well, Behe introduced this concept and discussed these mechanisms, and he paid a price for challenging Darwinian evolution. The good thing is he got tenure and he got a Nobel Prize before he wrote this book, because it's my belief that if he had written the book first, he'd never have gotten the Nobel Prize or tenure, because he was challenging a sacred cow of the biological field, namely Darwinian evolution. Well, and go back and look at Darwin's book, Origin of the Species. He stated if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous, successive, slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Well, Behe has shown such a thing, and I believe Darwin's theory has broken down, because there are things that can't be created just by small, slight changes. Well, the bacterial flagellar motor is one example of irreducible complexity. It's a really good example. It's the thing that causes a bacterium to move around by having this little tail, this little propeller that flails out behind it and spins around and causes motion. But it is an amazing device, and this is looking at it, this is in terms of showing molecules, and essentially all the molecules are arranged together and in various proteins in just such a way that they form this motor. It really kind of looks like an electric motor, and it spins at an amazing 100,000 RPMs and can reverse its direction in a quarter of a turn. The things that we can't do with our own electric motors, it's able to do. It has all the parts. It has the rotor, the shaft, the drive shaft, and the rotor mechanism that's attached to the drive shaft. It sits within a stator, which is the static part, and it turns within that at very high speeds, and it has a universal joint that connects the motor, the drive shaft, to the propeller. So, pretty amazing little device. Well, where did the parts of this come from? Now, evolutionists would normally make an argument, well, all these parts probably existed in other mechanisms, and somehow after they all existed for that purpose, then they got reassembled into this flagellar motor. Well, the problem is only 10 of the 40 parts exist in other molecular machines. I guess that means 30 parts are unique to this. And if you had all the parts available, where did the assembly instructions come from? Because this is assembled in the cell, assembled in just the right order. If you don't assemble it in the right order, it doesn't work. Kind of like things we put together in our garage or shop. You've got to assemble it just the right way in order for it to function. Well, it's a good question. How did the bacterial flagellar motor come to exist? If it couldn't be just parts dropped together and forming a motor, it had to be assembled carefully out of parts that didn't exist for any other purpose. So, we ask then, is irreducible complexity evidence of intelligent design? If it's not, where does irreducible complexity come from? How did the parts get here, and how did the assembly get created of all these parts? The human genome itself, like we said, is like a computer program of 3 billion instructions. Where did the information come from in DNA? Did it somehow accidentally arise? Did one of Shakespeare's plays just accidentally appear when somebody dropped all the letters of the alphabet in and shook them up and dropped them onto a board? Of course not. Furthermore, there's a chicken and egg problem. DNA needs molecular machines to read it, interpret it, and copy it. And these molecular machines build other proteins. But the instructions for building the molecular machines is in the DNA. So which came first? Did the DNA come first or the molecular machines? How does one provide any value without the other? Well, it seems to me both had to come at the same time. Both had to be there. The DNA for the instructions and the machines that read it. And did both arise at the same time due to an intelligent designer? Which is the more logical conclusion to reach? Finally, looking at genetics, is the human genome improving? Well, the theory of evolution, Darwinian evolution, would suggest that we're getting better and more advanced. The evidence doesn't seem to show that. In fact, the human race is getting weaker. Scientists have determined that harmful mutations are added in every generation. Now, I've heard different people claim some that there are 35 mutations per generation and up to as many as 300 mutations per generation. And depending upon which rate you assume, the human race can only have been around for several thousand years or maybe up to 100,000 years, not for millions of years. And it's difficult to identify mutations within either man or animal that are really beneficial. Evolutionists have touted a few mutations, said this is proof that the mutations could be beneficial. The one I really remember best has to do with a fish. I think it was called the stickleback fish. And the situation was that it has a mutation that allows it to live in, I believe it's fresh water, so it's natural to salt water. But the mutation does not really add any feature to the fish. The mutation breaks the fish's susceptibility to salt water. So where it normally would find salt water toxic, by breaking some of its functionality, it now can live in fresh water. I may have it backwards. It could be vice versa. But I'm not aware of any new functions ever being created by mutation. People have tried to find some and point them out, but generally speaking, when you look into it, it's discovered that what happened was some function of the organism actually got broken, and that turned out to be useful in a particular situation. It's always easier to break things than it is to create new ones. Just like in computer programs. Boy, it is so easy to break a computer program. Very hard to make it work, to fix it. I've discovered that. And so no one in their right mind has ever suggested that we fix Microsoft Windows by making random changes to it. That would be a recipe for disaster. Instead, we know that thousands of smart programmers work on Microsoft Windows to try to fix bugs, and sometimes they succeed, and quite often they fix one bug and create another one. So even the intelligence doesn't always allow us to introduce improvements. So how would random chance mutations create an improvement in an organism? Well, they don't. My first encounter with evolution goes back to high school. I had a freshman biology teacher who assigned me a report on Darwin's theory of evolution. She didn't assign that to the whole class. She picked me. And I think she thought, as one of the better students in the class, if I went off and investigated Darwinian evolution, that I would come back convinced of the truth and would then influence the other students in the class. So I came back and gave the report to the class, and I talked about the two mechanisms of evolution, mutations and natural selection. I had no argument with natural selection, as it obviously occurs, but it can only select for traits that are present. So I questioned the ability of mutations to account for the complexity of life. I pointed out that almost all, if not all, mutations are harmful to the organism. Very few, if any, are beneficial, and that could not account for the origin of life and the development of the complex life we see. Well, it's been 50 years, over 50 years, and I've studied and read a lot on this topic, and I would give exactly the same report today that I gave 50 years ago. Mutations are not making things better, they're making things worse. In fact, I always wondered about that biology teacher. She dressed like she'd grown up in a very conservative religious background, very plain, no makeup, and I always thought maybe she was just reacting against something in her past and was turning away from religion for some reason because of her experiences. I don't know that. I'm just suspecting it because of the way she dressed and looked. But she thought I was going to become a convert to Darwinism, and it did not work. It backfired, and I reported exactly the opposite when I gave my report to the class. So we might ask the question, why does Darwinian evolution persist as a theory, widely accepted theory, despite the evidence against it? And I would argue that it's a faith system. It allows people to avoid belief in a God, a creator, a supreme being to whom they might be accountable. It is a faith system based upon the underlying principles of naturalism and secular humanism. Naturalism says that the material or the natural world is all there is. Carl Sagan made famous this quote. He began his famous TV series by saying, "The cosmos is all that is or was or ever will be." Secular humanists believe that man is the highest form of life and is the measure of all things. If you accept those two fundamental principles, you can't believe in a God. And so you have to come up with something else, which is why the secular humanists have turned to evolution. They refuse to accept the existence of anything apart from the material world. And one well-known evolutionist has said, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such a hypothesis is excluded from science because it is not naturalistic. So they've written the rules to say there is no God, and they won't even consider a God. Well, when you reach that point, I would say you have a faith system. You don't have free scientific investigation and inquiry. So evolution is their only explanation for the existence of life on Earth. And if you don't believe that, try asking an evolutionist what the alternatives are for explaining the universe and for explaining life. My guess is they won't have any alternatives. That's the only one they've got. And because it's all they've got, they always modify the evolution story to try to work around any problems that are pointed out. They always want to invent a justification for why evolution could indeed work. Well, what are the facts? Some people think, well, evolutionists have facts and creationists have facts. Really, science has facts. Every scientist has access to the same facts. There's not a separate set of facts for evolution or for creation. Well, in a sense, there are certain facts that poke big holes in evolutionary theory, and creationists just point those out, where evolutionists would tend to whitewash them or minimize them. Even the evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould once wrote, "Facts do not speak for themselves, they are read in the light of theory." So, yeah, we have facts, but it's a person's belief system that's going to color how they interpret those facts. In this presentation, I've discussed some accepted scientific facts that I believe reveal fatal flaws in the theory of Darwinian evolution. There is so much more information. There are books and more books that have been written on this topic. Lots of facts I could discuss if I had, a couple of weeks to give this presentation, but just time doesn't permit. I've attempted to list some of the most easily understood and the best arguments against Darwinian evolution. Now, many who want to believe in evolution will deny some facts or downplay the facts or try to explain the flaws away. And you're going to have to decide what you'll do with this information. But I would like you to remember, scientific truth is not determined by a majority vote. And I had one PhD physics student I was talking with, and I pointed things out. And he says, well, the majority of scientists believe that, so it must be true. Not necessarily. There are times in the past when the majority of scientists have believed a number of things that were finally determined not to be true. But God is not subject to a majority vote. Scientific truth isn't. Scientific truth is what it is. And we need to objectively look at the facts, look at the evidence, and make a decision. I would like to point out here, toward the end, the work of a noted French mathematician. His name was Marcel Paul Schutzenberger. He lived in the previous century, in the 20th century, died in 1996, but he had doctorates in medicine and mathematics, especially information theory. And he was a member of the French Academy of Sciences, which is a fairly elite group. Schutzenberger became increasingly critical of Darwinian evolution through his study of information theory. And he presented a paper in the 1966 Wistar Symposium and said the following things. A theory of evolution that depends on uniformly randomly occurring mutations cannot be the truth because the number of mutations needed and the time that would be needed for those mutations to have happened by chance exceed by thousands of orders of magnitude the time that has been available. Thousands of orders of magnitude doesn't mean thousands of years. It means trillions times trillions times trillions of years. He said further, there is no chance, and he gave it as a probability, less than 10 to the negative 1,000th power. Now that means less than one chance in 1 followed by 1,000 zeros. So he said no chance to see this mechanism appear spontaneously, and if it did, even less for it to remain. And that's because the third quote I've got is anything that was produced by a random process is more likely to be destroyed by the very same process than it is to be improved by further random changes. That's like I was saying, you don't improve a computer program by making random changes. It's much easier to break something that works than it is to create a new working system. And that was back in 1966, which is about a year or two after I gave my report in the freshman biology class, and he's saying the same thing, that the mutations are going to break the mechanism, not improve it, and the odds of this ever happening are so tiny as to be zero. Well, now we understand a lot more about the complexity of life. All the information about those molecular machines that we talked about, that occurred after Schutzenberger first gave his paper in 1966, and he became increasingly in opposition to Darwinian theory the longer he lived, probably because the evidence just kept piling on and showing the weaknesses of it. Well, what's it all about? I would say it's really all about the story. Both evolutionists and creationists have a story for the origin of life. Now, evolutionists have their story. They change their story quite often as flaws are discovered in the theory. But really, the only thing that matters is having the story, is supporting the theory of evolution. It doesn't matter. The evolutionists can get together and argue and change the story, refine the story. But really, the only time they get incensed is when somebody suggests that the story doesn't work, that there must be an intelligent designer, a God. As we talked about, they invented the story of punctuated equilibrium, where a small group of animals gets off by themselves and quickly evolves, and that explains the lack of transitional fossils. That was one of the first stories they invented to support evolution. More recently was the panspermia. Well, the life must have come from outside of our galaxy. It must have evolved in another galaxy long ago and then got introduced to ours, which doesn't address the problem either. It's just that there will always be, as many flaws as are found in evolution, there will be stories created to try to plug the holes and address the flaws. I would caution you to beware the use of the word must, especially when there's no supporting data to go with it. When you hear somebody say it must be, there's quite possible that there is no evidence at all, and what they're really saying is, in order for my theory, for my belief system to be true, this must have happened. So since we don't find any transitional fossils, a group of animals must have gone off into a corner somewhere and quickly evolved so that they didn't leave fossils. That's the kind of way you'll see the word must used. So creationists base their story on an eyewitness account. That is the account of God himself. And that's what we believe the Bible is God's account of his creation of the world, his interaction with mankind. Our understanding of creation has changed some over the years, not in radical ways, but one thing that I think many creationists now agree on is that when God created animal life and plant life, he created kinds. Kinds could be something broader than a species. It could be a family or a genus of some animal. So, for example, maybe the bovine kind or the canine or the feline kind. Because we've discovered that within those broad categories, there's a lot of crossbreeding that can occur, and tigers and lions can crossbreed, and genetically they're not that different from other cats. They're all cats, and so maybe all of the genetic material needed for the cat kind was present when God created the animals, and that they did evolve, and that some traits got selected out to create the big cats, lions and tigers, and other traits were selected out to create the small house cats we see, or the wild cats. So there is the statement in the Bible that says, "And God made the beast of the earth according to its kind, cattle according to its kind, and everything that creeps on the earth according to its kind, and God saw that it was good. So we creationists do believe that God created this. He may have created things in broad kinds with all the genetic material that was necessary for the species to exist. At any rate, I think the evidence is there that God created the earth. You'll have to decide if you want to believe the story that's constantly changing of evolution, or you want to believe the story that God created the heavens and the earth. I'd like to conclude this with a few quotes from the Bible. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That is a fundamental statement of truth. Now, as some have pointed out, the Bible is not a scientific book in that it's not trying to tell us how He did everything. It is trying to give us some of the basics of the creation, but God was not trying to reveal how He did it. I'm not even sure we could have understood it if He did reveal that. There's a quote from the Psalms, 139:14, "I will praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made." I think we've seen that in this presentation. Life is complex. It is wonderfully designed. When you can see a little kinesin molecule walking through a cell pulling cargo with it. I mean, God has just a wonderful and complex creation. In Acts chapter 17, the Apostle Paul wrote, "God who made the world and everything in it, since He is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands, nor is He worshipped with men's hands as though He needed anything, since He gives to all life, breath, and all things. And He has made from one blood every nation of men to dwell on the face of the earth, and has determined their pre-appointed times and the boundaries of their dwellings, so that they should seek the Lord in the hope that they might grope for Him and find Him, though He is not far from each one of us." I think it's interesting that He says, from one blood or one race, God's created all men that dwell on the earth. We've discovered, in fact, in genetics, in this study, they've discovered that there appears to be a common female ancestor of all human beings. There appears to be a common male ancestor. God made from one pair, from Adam and Eve, He created all men. We're all related. And God reveals Himself to us in the Bible and in nature as the creator of everything. There is ample evidence of the creation. It's up to you to accept it. Thank you.